the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus, we give you thanks for this day. Just thank you and praise you for the beauty of the day, the beauty of the weather. Thank you for the gift of life. I pray that we would treasure life, treasure relationships with each other. And just pray for this community here, and for the parish of St. Bartholomew. Pray for their continued success. Pray for just the growth in our own holiness and love in our church and our faith. For all those who we've asked promise to pray for, I pray, Lord, that you bless them, bless our families. In Jesus' name, amen. Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So, we'll be a small and mighty group, yes?
Yes.
Okay. There we go. So, what I thought I would do tonight, Allie told me not to talk more than 2 hours, so I promised I would. No. Short amount of time, okay? So I'm thinking, I don't know actually what time you gave me, I forget already. But I figured maybe a half an hour we can go through. And I think that part of understanding what's going on in the Holy Land and the crisis in the Holy Land is there's several things to learn. So, like, Clark, for you, a little bit of history, since you love history. We have to look at the history to understand part of what's going on in the Holy Land, the problem in the Holy Land. As you mentioned, I grew up in an Arab world, so if you are, not familiar with living in a Muslim country, it's obviously very different than what we live there. So for Christians in the Holy Land, also understanding that they're in between the fact of predominantly Jewish and Muslim culture, right? So imagine some of the things. I'm going to give you a number of kind of like little takeaways for you, things to think about. All right. Part of it is understanding the situation, so that, and not only that, but then knowing how you relate to that and things that you can do, because there are plenty of things that each of you can do to help. And that's the beauty of it. It's not a problem that's just the Holy Land problem. It's the church's issue, right? Think of it this way. If you didn't have the church originally in Jerusalem, you don't have a church here in Columbus. Right? It's the mother church. It's the one church that all of it. And it's interesting how our last three books, too, have been so universally in support of the Holy Land, right? Go to the Holy Land, visit the Holy Land. All of them have been to the Holy Land, right? I mean, just an amazing support and outreach for these Christians. So, anyway, we'll go through a number of things, and then at the end, I thought if you have questions, we can just, I'll do the best to answer all of those that I can. It's very much a political hotbed as well, as you know, right now, with what's going on with ISIS and the issues in Syria and Iraq. So I can address some of that, but understand I'm not a theologian that understands everything about the Muslim world. It's just I can understand our response to it. So, okay, does that sound right? And then
can I ask a question just to help us set the tone? In Holy Land alone, what is the percentage of Christians and specific Catholic?
Okay, and that is a good question, and that'll be in your butt.
Okay.
But to know it up front, the percentage of Christians in the Holy Land, which includes both Israel and the West Bank, which we'll talk about what those are, it's less now than 2%, about 1.5%, so about 150,000 Christians out of a total of over 8.6 million people. So it's very, very small. Of that, the Latin Rite is about 45%. Latin Rite Catholics. The next biggest component is Greek Orthodox. So the Orthodox Church, you got to understand, every part of our church, both Orthodox, Russian, Greek, Latin, everybody's in the Holy Land, right? You can't find a religious order that doesn't have some semblance of and that's the beauty of it. You walk around and see all these different nuns and all their different habits, and it's this conglomeration of just this world of people. So anyway, we'll go through it. Unfortunately, I did this on a presentation. So I'd like for this to be up and high like this so I can do it, but I need to keep on clicking. So if I keep looking down, just understand that I'm kind of dealing with what I have. So let's kind of look look at this. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction, so be able to take a look at it from a worldly perspective. I want you to be able to understand it from the two sides, right? Because there's always two sides to every issue. I want to look at all the different statistics that would help you to understand the situation. And then for you, in other words, why is this issue important at all? Now, hopefully their Wi-Fi works pretty well because I threw in a couple of different short videos that we produced. Even one that you guys said you had John Andrew from Blackstone Productions here talking one night or whatever. John Andrew and I worked on a little project together to help, so that was kind of neat. And then really the action, which is the takeaway, like what do we do? All right, so the what do we do part has to do with what the church has done, but then what can you do? Right? So let's start and get right into the beginning. So as I mentioned, there are two sides to every story. You are reading a lot now about different situations where you can say Israel did this, but then Palestinians did this. Remember just recently when Father Myers was in the Holy Land, of which these two wonderful ladies were there. This was a major crisis going on in the West Bank, right? If you remember, recall that from the news where there was this whole thing of Israel firing things, blowing up all different parts of the West Bank, and then, the Hamas sending rockets outside into Israel. And typically, this is a pattern, by the way. This is what happens. I just feel like they have to go and get in a little fist fight. They punch each other, and then they say, okay, we can get along for a while. And then they say, they shake hands, and then they move on. And then, 2 years later, it comes back. That's been going on for, maybe thousands of years, right? I mean, it's always been there, okay? So, when you say, first of all, where is the Holy Land? Part of it is understanding, like when you guys flew, right? Big flight over. We know that in Israel proper, you can see that Israel is surrounded by both Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. Of course, outside of that is Iraq, right? And then Egypt. Okay. Now, compare size-wise here. There's the state of New Jersey. And when you look at just Israel itself, it is actually smaller than the state of New Jersey, right? So and when you look at the total part there, you see the part in gray. Well, in fact, I think I have. The part in gray is all part of what's called the Palestinian Authority, where the part in black is Israel proper. Okay? When we say the Gaza Strip, right? You've heard that in terms of where the Hamas are. That little piece of land that you see right there that's against the Mediterranean, that little piece of gray land is the Gaza Strip. And inside that little piece of the Gaza Strip is basically 1.5 million Muslims and a very small number of Christians that are there, but they're confined. It's like a little prison, right? Can't get in, can't get out, right? They're completely surrounded by Israel. So, part of the issue that goes back in history, when you look at and talk about the Holy Land, is it's really all about the land. When you think about it, when you go back to pre-1946, the majority of all of the land that is now known as Israel was all Palestinian land. Think about that. Okay? Prior to World War II, all of that was Palestinian land. When you had, after the UN partition in 1947, you can see what happened. And then after that, in 1967, this was the UN resolution that said, Israel, you now get to form your own state of Israel, which was formed then. And then the red there is supposedly the state, which would be Palestine. Well, you can see what's happened even as we went into over 2000. That Israel continually went in and took pieces of land. I didn't want to get into that particularly in this talk because it's a very controversial issue, but are you familiar with the word the settlements? You ever heard of that word settlements? It's all tied into this, what they call the right of return. In other words, in our Protestant faith, they believe that what happens is when all these Jews come back, right? and they come back into Israel, that then the Messiah will return. Well, so what has Israel been doing? All those Russian Jews, the Polish Jews, all the different Jews, they've been inviting them to come back to Israel. The problem is they have no place to put them. So what do? They go, they take a big piece of Palestinian land, they basically build what is like a city on it that can house anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 people. And then all those people from all those countries get thrown into these settlements. Okay? There are hundreds of them, all spread throughout Palestine. So you can imagine if somebody came in like that, right? Like just took the nicest piece of land in Columbus, and then all of a sudden made that their land, right? It'd be very difficult. Okay, as I mentioned, there are two areas. One is Israel. In Israel, you have all three of these denominations. Part of the difficulty, by the way, for Americans, especially in the Western world, is it's hard for us to differentiate between nationality, your ethnicity, right, your religion, your culture, all of these things, right? So in Israel, you have Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In the Palestinian Authority, you only have Christians and Muslims, right? So in Palestine areas, there are no Jews. They're not allowed to be there, with the exception of what? Those settlements, which, again, they're illegal settlements. So here are the challenges. If you are a Christian living in the Holy Land, here's what you're dealing with. The first thing is you're going to be dealing with political discrimination. There are laws that particularly target Christians. Of course, in any government situation, you don't have Christian representation. Okay? So they're either, of course, in the Knesset, it's all Jews, right? It makes for a very difficult situation when you don't have any representation whatsoever. Unemployment is another issue that's difficult for Christians, but even we'll look at it from the standpoint of people as a whole. In Israel proper, we have 30% unemployment, but in the West Bank, there's 65% unemployment. I mean, think about that, all right? I was just talking with Clark about his, looking for a job and how difficult it is as a teacher and whatnot. Can you imagine being in the 65% unemployment status? I mean, this country, right, we have a national average of close to 8 or 9%. So comparing those kinds of numbers can make it very difficult. We'll come back to that. There's all kinds of restriction of movement. Remember that Israel has built what is called they call it a separation fence. I think you can look at that one picture. We have to show you some others here. But they're not really fences, are they? They're huge walls, right, that are meant to divide people. What's the last wall that you remember being built? Big walls that separate countries. Right, exactly, the Berlin Wall. And how instrumental Pope John Paul II was in getting that removed. Well, wait till you see the difference. Okay. And by the way, when you talk about a restriction, this is interesting. It was easier for you, Michelle, and Allie, for them to go on a pilgrimage, right, all the way over to Israel, than it was for any Palestinian, for example, living in Bethlehem, to get to Jerusalem, right, 5 miles away. It's harder for them to do that than for us to go all the way across them. That's the difficulty. Economic activity. What happened here is when the wall was created, thousands of Palestinians who used to work in Jerusalem no longer could work. So if you think about that from the standpoint of what if all of a sudden we build a wall around Columbus, but you happen to work in Indianapolis? Or you even have to work not even that far. You can no longer work, and that's it. They wouldn't let you in, they wouldn't let you out. That was so. You got to try to put yourself in their position, right? How would you respond? If you were a Palestinian. And so here's a big issue that we've been dealing with, especially in our country, right? When you talk about what was originally the Arab Spring that started early years ago, especially in the Obama early administration, then the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, right, which took over in Egypt, countries. We thought that that was going to be a good thing. Has any of that been good, by the way? Is there anything good that's been going on tonight? No. And here's why. We look now at Syria and Egypt and whatnot. Well, now what you have to add into this equation is the whole ISIS situation. Okay? So it's a very difficult, I can't even imagine being a woman trying to live in the Muslim world that is dominated by ISIS. Right? You think of how you would have to live. Okay? Some of that pressure is there in Israel. I mean, you definitely see it. So, what is the result of all of these things? Well, the result of these, and we'll look at the details now, is that there's a real crisis, obviously, in the Holy Land. The entire Christian presence in the Holy Land now is, as we said, down to less than 1.5%. So we have, right now, what we're dealing with in our parishes, we have about 300 families that are leaving each year. Christians, as I said, are now less than 2% of the total population. And the thing is, everybody says this, including, obviously in our church, that something must be done. The question is, what should be done? Right? Well, I had an opportunity, I spent a lot of time talking here, and you'll see, and hopefully this will, by the way, this is some built-in speakers, so I'm hoping that it's going to be loud enough to hear. But I'm going to play a couple of different videos that some of our priests here with you need to hear. And let's just see if we can get a feel for it. Again, the question is,
we have a tendency, from the American point of view, to kind of be political behaviorists. We can impose a solution that would change history. Well, it won't. And wherever we've tried that, it's always failed.
So, now let's take something about looking at the unemployment. As I mentioned, the unemployment, this is for Palestinian men. 65% unemployed, 35% employed. Compare that here, where in the U.S., as we mentioned, we have 8% unemployment, 92%. I want you to think about how much you make. Okay? Whatever it is that you do for your job, whatever. Think about how much you make. And then keep in mind that the average Israeli salary is somewhere around $26,000. The average Palestinian salary is $6,000 a year. $6,000. Okay? Poverty level is almost right at $6,000. Actually, it's a little bit less. Probably more like $4,000 or $5,000 a year. But can you imagine making that for a year and having to get by? Okay? So if you live in Palestine, right? This is some of the things that you're dealing with. Okay? Now, bring that into basis. Here's the wall. And we talked about the demographics of the wall, and I just mentioned that I would come back to this, because in 2002 is when Israel began to build this wall to regulate going in and out of, between Palestine and Israel. It costs over $1 million a mile. Okay? The majority of this, by the way, is being paid for by your taxes. Okay? In other words, our foreign aid to Israel pays to build this wall, which separates people. Now, again, it's not the issue of the fact that sometimes separating from what would be like somebody putting on a bunch of, explosives or whatever and walking into a restaurant and blowing themselves up, right? Okay, clearly that's not a good thing. We understand that. But at the same time, you have to think about at what level can you totally shift, like, a whole population's economic, or level. Where is it worth it? Now, compare the difference here. When you look at the Berlin Wall is 12 feet tall. Okay? This wall is 26 feet tall. Over twice as long. The Berlin Wall was 100 miles long. This is 440 miles long. imagine that? I mean, just the building of something, a superstructure so big to separate people. So 94%, by the way, of this wall will be built on Palestinian land. So you remember when I showed that graph that showed that in 1967 there was this little piece of land that was Palestinian, and then the West Bank piece that was called Gaza. Those two pieces of land were protected actually by UN resolutions, and they call it the Green Line. So what they did is they had this imaginary, right, this line that they said, Israel, you cannot go inside this line. This land does not belong to you. Okay. What we're saying here is that 94% of that wall is well inside that line. So they're, in retrospect, Israel is actually in violation in numerous places, by the way, of many UN resolutions. Do you ever hear about that? Why? Huh?
U.S. media.
Oh, well, that's true too. That's a very good thing, right? We haven't said that, but U.S. media is very pro-Israel. That are also, in many ways, they're owned, right? Jewish-owned, New York Times, Boston Globe, right? They have a great impact in our society. But what else? We're building it. What's that? We're building it. We're building it, absolutely. And think of it this way: who's our big ally? Right? You have one democratic country in the middle of an entire Arab world, right? So the U.S. is, you know, if all of a sudden we came against Israel heavily, right? How would that go over? Not very, right? We know that. So it's a political thing, right? It's a game of politics. So unfortunately, not very much gets done. So what? 47% of this land, by the way, will have been annexed into Israel proper. That's what's happening. So they're taking people's land, basically, you know, if those, let's say you had your whole family history, or your business was, say, olive wood, you had these whole olive groves. They just go in, demolish all the olive groves, move in, build a wall, and you lose your land. You get no choice. There's no choice about it at all. Okay? So, if we look at the total population, by the way, if you just look at what's happened since 1948, 80% is Christian, 80% non-Christian, 20% Christian. Order up! Today, as we said, 1.5% Christian. And how is that built up? Well, of that, when we said where's that big population, 35% of those Christians live in the West Bank. 115% of those Christians live in Israel proper. So, to give you an example, a little town like Bethlehem, which you visited, is actually in the West Bank. It's completely surrounded by that wall. In order for you to get in, even as a pilgrimage group, you had to cross through that wall, that barrier. You probably remember that. You had checkpoints, you know, that you had to go through. So, isn't it interesting? And yet, it's only 5-6 miles from Jerusalem, right? But there is a good number of Christians, obviously, still living there. This is another example of what happened in Bethlehem. As we said, Bethlehem used to be a stronghold for the Christian presence. 80% of them were Christian. Today, look at the number. So Bethlehem itself, one of the strongest holds of Christianity, right, in this Arab world, went from 80% to 90%. Right? I would call that a severe problem. I'm going to skip that one video. Here's the piece that I was telling you about in terms of like foreign aid. So of your tax dollars, by the way, we gave $5.6 billion to Israel. When you think about that, the Palestinian Authority got $1.7 million. Okay, look at the discrepancy. And then how much of that $1.7 million do you think actually trickled down to Christians? Zero. None. Right? Nothing. So you can see, and this will be apparent later, why the Catholic Church's presence in the Holy Land is so important. Okay, so in terms of why it matters, I've had a lot of people tell me, look, let's just get them out of there. Let's let them leave. Who cares? It doesn't matter. We don't need Christians in the world there. Let them go. Let them come to the United States, which they do second largest concentration of Palestinians is in Detroit, right? So if you think about it, many of them have left, yes, but is that what we need to do? So I thought this is a very interesting perspective, and I want you to think about this here, what this father had to say. Great video, too, I wish.
It seems to me that as we look at this eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, that's kind of a universal sense of justice, that we have watched that at work in the Middle East for a very long time, and have a real lack of charity, as you strive to find some kind of justice in the whole situation. It's not going to happen. Israel's already extended the wall over into Palestinian territory. They're cutting villages in two. They're cutting the famous case of the monastery where they cut the monastery off from its orchard. I mean, what's going to stop it? What's going to stop in any kind of reconciling presence between two people who are in conflict? When you have two people in conflict whose sense of justice is getting even, or taking advantage, where are you going to end up? Just more of the same. So in my mind, anyway, the presence of Christianity in the Middle East is an essential piece of any kind of lasting, peaceful solution to the conflict. Anything that makes it possible for Christians to live and to stay in the Holy Land, in the Middle East, is a contribution to humanity, because it's a contribution to a presence that represents a way of solving a problem. And every Catholic has the obligation to encourage the universal mission of the Church. And if someone is drawn particularly to do that in the Middle East, that's exceptionally virtuous, I think.
So, I'm going to cut through a couple things here because I want to explain this myself, but think about what he said, okay? And I just try to rework that, make sense for you. In a country where the only way to solve my problem, right, is that we get even. So, you kill my mother, I go and I kill your mother. And then, by the way, I kill somebody else too, just because that's the only way to get even, right? Okay, what he's saying is when is enough enough, right? Show me in the doctrines of, say, the Quran, or look in Jewish, where does it say, love your enemy? Say that, does it? Or pray for those who persecute, or on and on, right? We go on through the scripture, right? So, the essence of Christianity, the reason that it works so well as a glue, for example, in the Holy Land, we're going to hear right now, this Father Custos is his name. It's like, he's like a bishop level. He reports directly, he's the head of all the Franciscans in the world, okay? He lives right there in Jerusalem. Order up! He reports only to the Pope, so it's a real easy connection. You got a problem, you just call the boss, right? Real easy. He's going to talk a little bit about why it's important to have Christians there, but think about that. If we could somehow give somebody a different way of looking at something, okay? To understand that there may be a way to resolve a problem other than you killing so-and-so and you killing so-and-so, right? Or somebody's blowing this up, or somebody's doing this. Think about it. All you got to do is look at ISIS thing, and it makes sense, right? So you have to have a presence there that will give an option other than what they have to work with, right? Think of it this way. It's like we all know people who just have like a life without God? Now, people don't want to admit that, right? But the reality is, take that certain pieces out, right? And life does not work, right? And so you can understand that if you put the Catholic Church smack dab in the middle between Israel, right, and the Muslim world, right, we have an important mission, right? It's key. People don't look at it. Like I had a lawyer one time tell me that he couldn't understand this whole issue. Like he was having problems understanding why Christians should be there. So I had to kind of put it in terms of his own language. And when I started to explain to him about, in lawyer terms, like for example, mediation in a court case. You can keep slapping each other around, and people do that all the time, right, in a court case. But at some point when you have mediation, right, and if the mediation would be the equivalent of, say, the Christians there between both sides, you know, would that make sense? And all of a sudden that makes sense to him, right? But that's what it is. So you and I have a real purpose to be involved in the Holy Land. For example, people say, well, why should I get involved in the Holy Land? That's not me. No, that's a universal call of the church, just like Father mentioned. So if you actually feel drawn to that, then wow, right? How exciting. And I can tell you this, you may not know how Allie and Michelle feel about this, but when I went to the Holy Land, even my first time, which I've been 20-some odd times, there was something that changed in my heart, right? There was something where I knew God was calling me to do something, right? And a couple of years later, we ended up actually getting involved with the Franciscans here in the United States, which are the extension of the Franciscans in the Holy Land, all the OSMs. And here we are 15 years later running that entire organization for them. Yeah. So all the work of the Franciscans for the foundation, right, of the Holy Land, which you even came up with that Father Peter. Both of you? How awesome. I mean, we had our president here, what, it was like 2 or 3 weeks ago? And these guys came all the way up from, here, all the way up to Indianapolis. I mean, and he's very typical, like, well, actually he's not typical, he's very New Yorkish. He was a late vocation, he's in his 60s now, and A-type personality, right? But he's perfect for the job, right? But you understand, I mean, it was something that was so important, right? That now, where the Lord has put me, has allowed me to have a direct influence in what the Franciscans are doing.
I'm still laughing about
here's what problem is.
saying ratchets to me.
I'm sorry, this takes a little bit.
You were talking about wrenches. I've got multiple
This is our important because Christianity is a commission.
You were talking about
So
selecting torque.
the place
I don't have any of those in my
the history
garage.
of
Just wrenches.
Nazareth, Bethlehem,
If you're telling me
they
that,
say what we say about Jesus is not a theory,
right.
but is a fact, and we can touch it. All sides, without the Christian community,
I'm gonna spread it.
communities are just normal.
I think I
The
can
Christian communities,
get my
they have become our churches, places where the Christian community meet, baptize the children, they marry and so on. And the Christian community, like all the people, like all the persons that are in the world, they need what all the people need. Job, house, happy families, relations. So, and the role of the Christians here, the Christian communities, or all the Christian institutions, especially the custody of the land, is to help, cannot pretend to be the only one, but to help the Christian community to have a normal life in our land, through housing projects, schools, Christian educations, and job opportunities for the families and so on.
I'm going to come back and revisit some of the points that you made. So there's a couple of other interviews. One of the things that, I don't think you guys met him, Brother Gray, the University, Bartholomew University. Did you guys meet him? Okay. I had a good opportunity to spend a lot of time with him. But he said, an interesting quote, and we'll see him in the video here in a minute, but he said, beyond his understanding, peace is going to come. difference here is that this is all going to tie back into the presence of the Catholic Church in the Holy Land, okay? In terms of the Franciscans. Our own Pope Francis says we must not resign ourselves to thinking of the Middle East without Christians, who for over 2,000 years have proclaimed Christ's name and created as citizens to all effects in terms of social, cultural, and religious life of nations to which they belong. He's saying this only, not even a year ago. This is what, now by the way, just to put this a little bit in perspective, the university in Bethlehem is the only Catholic university at all in all of Palestine. Most of even our Christian students do not go to Catholic schools in terms of university. Like the #1 school in all of Israel is Hebrew University. It's kind of like saying the Yale of the Middle East. And so what happens is Christians will go to school there in Hebrew where all the classes are taken in Hebrew. So for example, I've often thought that our university students never appreciated in this country the gift of education, right? Because if you watch them and they just kind of think their parents are going to pay for school and, look at the results, okay? We can look at that in our country and see. Make no mistake, there are certainly some people that probably think like that in the Holy Land, but it's not at all common. They value that education so much because if they can place themselves above everybody else, including Jews and Muslims, then who's going to get the jobs? And right now, the Christians are the most educated, highest educated of all. Now that's a plus to us because who's paying their tuition? Me. By the way, I really am. I mean, I have one student that I sponsor in the Holy Land. But I'm saying, when I say that, I'm saying the Catholic Church, us, right? So that's what Father was saying, the Franciscan Father Francis was saying, is that in order to maintain Christians there, right, what do you need? Think about what you need to be happy, right? If you can educate me, give me a job, and give me a place to live, right? I think I can make it. And that's what they say. That's what they're saying. If you can do those three things and help us, then we'll stay. We won't leave. We'll stay, we'll build our families, we'll get married, we'll do all those kinds of things. So this is interesting here, this perspective. And I think what's neat about this too is that Brother Bray's original...
People ask me, well, these current peace talks, what's the likelihood of them resolving this extension? And I'm very pessimistic about it. In the 2 years I've been here, I see the noose tightening around the neck of the Palestinian people and the restrictions increasing. So I'm not at all optimistic about that. But if we'd been having this conversation, say, 30 years ago, I would have said exactly the same thing about Northern Ireland, about South Africa, about Germany. And yet somehow, beyond my understanding, peace came in. So I'm keeping peace alive here, I hope alive here. That's one of the things that somehow, beyond my understanding, peace is going to come. And when it does come, what Palestine is going to need are educated, resourceful, creative Palestinians. And what Bethlehem University is doing is making a huge contribution, I believe, to creating that pool of people that are going to create the new Palestine.
Let me share just a little bit with you about what our church is doing about this whole problem. So let's look at it this way. First of all, within the Catholic Church, the majority of the presence of the Catholic Church in the Holy Land is by the Franciscans. There are others. For example, if you look at it like in our country, the diocesan level, right, if a priest is a priest, he's typically what kind of priest? A diocesan priest, right? Who controls his parish? The diocese, right? It's a diocesan piece. It's part of the bishop. Okay? In the Holy Land, that doesn't exist. The bishop is the low man. Okay? In other words, and the other name for the bishop is the patriarch. So when you hear that from like history, like the patriarch of Constantinople, right? Or whatever. The patriarch is the local bishop on a diocesan level. But compared to the Franciscans, when St. Francis was there right away, right? And the Lord said, what is it, 1219, rebuild my house, right? We know what he started doing. He started rebuilding an actual physical church, right? And that's not what was intended, right? And yet look at what he did in the Holy Land. Trying to actually, can you imagine going and trying to say we're going to convert the Sultan or something? You know? I mean, you should have had his head lopped off right there, right? But he was so gutsy and so convicted, right? And such a humble person that the Sultan actually looked at him and, you know, he wasn't going to become, you know, Catholic. But what did he do? He says, you can have control of all of these shrines, you know, all these things that you guys value, right, for Christendom. So think of what's in the Holy Land, right? The place where Calvary is, the place where Bethlehem, the place of Nazareth. I mean, think of all the things that are in the Holy Land, right? And because of the act of one man, like St. Francis, we today have those shrines that are still maintained over 800 years by the Franciscans. Think about that. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. So, and I'm just going to fly through these pictures just in the interest of time because we're going a little bit longer. But as I mentioned, like just our foundation alone here in the United States, we gave $6 million, over $6 million in scholarships. 261 kids, 95% graduation rate. Okay? Of those, over 70% of all the students are working. Okay, now think about that, in a 65% unemployment rate, right, in one, or 35% in another. And those who are not, which by the way is, there's another 20% that are women, the women went and got married and opted to raise families, okay? But in my opinion, that's not at all a wasted education, right? Because these women are highly educated, right? Did excellent in school, and now will be able to share that with their families, right? So, you know, like in this country, right? How do we? It just depends. Like if you look at that, like if you took and said, "I'm going to go home and I'm going to raise a family and have kids and whatever," and sometimes you can get that. Well, that's all you do. Like you're just at home taking care of kids. Hey, let me tell you, it's a hard job. All right, I did it for 3 years. Right? I went home and took care of my kids, knowing that that's what God wanted me to do. And it's the hardest thing. It's harder than any job that I do, right? Taking care of 5 children. So, here's an example of our boys. Now, think of it this way. Think of things that you could do. What if I could show you that you could kind of adopt one of these guys? Like, you know, maybe just help them, take care of them, help support their financial needs. You think like, oh, well, we can't do that from all the way here. You know what? These boys are part of the Franciscan Boys' Home. It's in Bethlehem. Every one of them have fathers or mothers who are either alcoholics, drug addicts, all live in a situation where they are not able to live at home. So they come and they live with us in our home, okay? In our Franciscan property. They all have, you know, teachers are all educated. We do this for $500 a year. Think about that. $40 some a month, right? Pretty cute. These are some of the little kids. Right? We have elderly homes, homes for both actually men and women separate. We have a Christmas program for all the people in Bethlehem. Last year, just to give you an idea, we gave 1,000 children Christmas gifts that would not otherwise have been able to even have Christmas. There's Father Peter leaning over helping. We build houses. This is one of the housing projects right outside of Bethlehem. So most of the Christians, by the way, will all live together. In other words, this could be, we would have Jewish or Muslim people here, right? This is owned by the Catholic Church, owned by the Franciscans. And then we have families that live there. That's Father Peter Vasco, who you guys saw. We were here actually with some of our group and whatever. We were showing them this is one of our largest properties that we built for about $8 million. It was $100,000 per unit. And, you know, a little over 75 units for all of these families. It's a great place. I mean, this just shows you what one of the inside people all getting their new keys to move into their properties. And these families would not have had a place to be if we didn't do that. What if I gave you a job? One of the things that in all of our housing units, what we do is we only hire Christian workers. So it's like the more we build, the more people we can hire, right? We also have different vocational programs. So, for example, there are students that just can't, don't have the acumen to just put into a full 4-year degree. But what if you could get a 2-year degree in woodworking, right? Or welding, all different types of things. So there's a whole vocational program. In all, we have 14 different programs, by the way, that the Franciscans and the Catholic Church support. And when I say what are these all meant to accomplish, we have numerous bishops and cardinals on our board. One of them is Bishop Dwayne here. But Cardinal Dolan, by the way, is the chairman on our board. You know, Cardinal Dolan was recently cardinal, but he also was the head of the College of Bishops, right, for quite a while. So this is interesting. Here, let's see what Bishop Dwayne had to say about it. By the way,
I think what the foundation does uniquely certainly makes a huge contribution here of education. But what it does in a very unique way is take the individuals where they are and, in a sense, make them more. Now, you can say that's education, you can say it's housing, gives them the opportunity. We're all called by Jesus Christ to be more. They can't do it there on their own. They just cannot. The odds are, in a sense, against them, numerically, financially, in every sense of the word. But we're called to be more. I can make that happen, very small contribution. As a whole, we Christians can truly make that happen. And that's what's unique about this foundation. You're right, we all have a lot of demands, a lot of things to do. This foundation is making a difference. It's more for so many people. That's what I hear and see in it. And to me, it's a good thing.
Bishop Dwayne's down in Venice, Florida, but is a big supporter on our board. Okay, so the last thing was, what can you do? And again, I'm just going to do this very quickly, but I'm going to finish with one last video that John, Andrew, and I worked on together. But you all possess the ability to pray. So, number one, we can pray, right? It's an important thing to do because believing in the power of prayer is believing that miracles can happen, right? It's commonplace. So, you mentioned prayer. You have already done this, but everybody can go and see for themselves. If you have not been, which I'm assuming that the rest of you have never been to the Holy Land, is that right? Okay. So one day, someday, right, do it, right? Life-changing. I believe personally, it's a life-changing thing. I also believe, by the way, it doesn't happen by accident. So if you're going, it's because God has called you to go at a very specific time and place in your life, and therefore you answer that call. But when you see with your own eyes, it has an interesting way of affecting how you read Scripture again. Little words, we went up to Judea. What does that mean? Up to Judea. Why didn't we go down to Judea? Well, go look and go see where Ein Karam is and where the visitation is, and then you look out and you go, wow, I get it, But nothing is the same, okay? So this makes for a great opportunity. I'll give you an example. Here is Father Schaefer. He's at the head of the Newman Center. We do a lot of pilgrimages for Newman groups, Newman Center groups. He recently was took a group, and this was during their spring break. But it was interesting because these are all college kids that went, right? When he got back, and I won't go into the great stories of conversion that happened here, but he said, and by the way, this is not a put down to World Youth Day, it's just his expression of the Holy Spirit. He goes, okay, we're not doing World Youth Day anymore. Instead, every year I'm taking a group to the Holy Land. I'm taking my college kids and we're going to the Holy Land and we're going to do it every year. Now, Well, he thought in his own mind that the bang for your buck sort of thing, like what happened to these people through the experience of the Holy Land was the most valuable thing that could have happened. And so he's going to the Holy Land every year, and they are. But interestingly enough, too, people that go on pilgrimages, Bishop Dwayne in the middle, and we have built regions all across the country, people that work full-time, whatever, that are very much involved in the foundation because we all have full-time jobs, right? But we want to be involved in something more than ourselves. And so the majority of these people that join regional groups have all been to the Holy Land. It's like an effective pilgrimage. Okay. Everybody can help financially. And it doesn't really matter what that level is, right? Think of it from tithing, right? You know, we all have an obligation to tithe. So that's not teaching you anything new. So just think of it from that perspective, you know? It's a level of trust that we give the Lord that says, by the way, I wish I could preach on tithing every week, because I think it's the greatest deal in the whole world. Where is it that you go and you get a job and you get to keep 90% and the Lord only asks for 10%? That's a heck of a deal. It really is, right? And yet, by the way, in this diocese, you know what the average tithing is? Guess. Take a guess. Huh? 2. Good guess. 1.2%. Wow. And you know what's interesting? At least this is what Decline did in their report earlier on when he was bishop. He said, if it was 2%, the entire archdiocese would be out of debt. So if we only give it 1.2, and by the way, Protestants don't do a much better job, but they do a better job. There's just like 1.4, 1.5%. And we didn't do, let's say we did 2, and now we're out of debt. What do you think God could do with 10%? It's a serious issue, something to think about. Okay, now, I mentioned here, the reason this is $50 to feed an entire family for a month. You know, I mentioned there that providing rent or elementary students or whatever. I mean, it's amazing. By the way, a whole year of tuition at Hebrew University, $6,000 a year. My son goes to Notre Dame, okay? Compare the two. All right, one goes to Notre Dame, one goes to Duke. The next one's at Purdue, okay? You add those things up, by the way, right there alone, I have $140,000 a year in tuition. For 3 kids, not counting rebuff, which is another $14,000 a year. Now, what if I had to pay all that? Like, we weren't getting any kind of help or whatever. You think about that. $40,000, I mean, it's ridiculous, is what it is, first of all, to pay $60,000, but it's amazing. And yet we can do that for $6,000 at the Yale of the Middle East, right? That's my way, by the way, of tithing, is I take that college kid and I just think, I'm changing his life totally. Okay, donations, social media. You are all active on social media, aren't you? In some way or another, is there something, right? Think of the impact that you can have on things that you can share, even if you were just pulling stuff and sharing from things that we already have, like on the foundations. Just think of it from that standpoint, you know? All of the things, every one of those, whether it's a blog, a YouTube thing, Google+, Twitter, Pinterest, you know, all of it, okay? And then the last one is all of us could be involved in some manner of raising awareness. So, for example, you could help put literature in the church. You could have, you know, a Holy Land ministry, which we have in a number of parishes. We've established Holy Land ministries so that we can, you know, give talks, show videos, do things like that, bring in other speakers from Holy Land, right? Just think, I mean, I don't have to go through all of these things, but just having all of those things that you can do in a parish, right, really make a difference. Okay. I want to end with this one video, which kind of, we actually used it at one of our dinners on our first one. But as I said, John Andrew helped us kind of collaborate on this and did this with Blackstone. So let's end here, and if you have any questions.
place of Christianity. They've been here for, 2,000 years, and they're disappearing.
If current trends continue, within 60 years, there will be no Christians living in the Holy Land.
The Franciscan Foundation really helps with the upkeep of the Holy Land. They're sending kids to college, be able to give them degrees and diplomas that help them to invest themselves then in the Holy Land.
Before getting this, the Holy Land Foundation scholarship, I was thinking about getting a job in Europe. I'm still here in the country. I'm having a very good job. I'm financially I'm very good. Thinking about not having this scholarship. I don't know where I am.
They made my dream come true.
It's essential that Christians live in the Holy Land because as far as Christians are concerned, this is the holiest spot on earth.
This is where Jesus was born, where he performed his miracles.
These are the places that are described in Scripture, and from the very earliest years in our faith, we hear about these holy places.
You've heard about Christ, you've read about Christ, then you're there. There's just no explaining how that becomes a person you knew.
Where he taught, where he suffered, died. There's no other pilgrimage site in the world that does that.
To read in the Psalms about Israel, about Jerusalem, and as I prayed those Psalms, I thought, hey, I'm right here.
It's just such a powerful moment, to know that this is where the heart of our faith is, because this is where Jesus was.
He came up and down the steps carrying the cross. He was in this room.
When we were leaving, it was just like, I felt like I was leaving my home.
Jesus chose the Holy Land as a place where he would redeem mankind.
Why are not all Christians and Catholics fighting tooth and nail to make this a hallowed, holy, celebrated land?
Blackstone Films, right? They said him as a speaker. So, you got to kind of put yourself into it and really think, what is your response to it? Right? Think about how you might be able to help. What kinds of things you could do. Okay, any questions? Things you might want to know that you can go through that kind of a pace that we did. Just a little bit of what I wanted to do. So, do you think it's important? You may not have known how important it was, right? I had a little boy when I was there one time. It's kind of like, when you hear out of the mouth of babes that word. We said, when is there going to be peace in this country? You know what his response was? Isn't it amazing? When Jesus comes back. And I thought, that's pretty deep, I mean, you think of why would a little boy, like no more than 7 or 8 years old, where would he be getting it? But they have hope. They do have hope for that area. That's the beauty of it. You can never give up. Right? It's so critical. And by the way, I'm a firm believer that if we had peace there, if we had peace in Jerusalem, we would have peace in the Middle East. It is the crux of the entire thing. 3 major world religions vying for one city, one holy place, right? By the way, who has the most claim to Jerusalem? goes back to the Crusades and everything. You think of all the people that have been fighting for Jerusalem, right? Who has most claim? Who was actually born in the Holy Land? Who was born in the Holy Land? Let's start with Christ. How about Jesus? Okay, think of the world religions, right? Muhammad? Was he born in the Holy Land? Nope. Saudi Arabia. Right? What about Abraham? Nope. Right? Modern day Iraq. I mean, if there's anybody that has a claim to that land, it's the Christians. And by the way, I gotta think of it this way. All your Christians are Palestinians. Right? Okay, think about that. If you take a Palestinian, they are either Christian or they're Muslim. But they're Arabs, right? So within the Arabs, like if you call certain Arabs, Palestinian, and yet they were, say, in Egypt or whatever, that would be a big no-no, right? Because just like them, the Arabs are hot-blooded, right? They all have their own. They're what? They're a nomad culture, right? It's these groups of people, right? So it's understanding those differences, and people go, oh, well, Palestinians, they're all terrorists. Now, wait a minute. Every single Christian that lives there is a Palestinian. So we got to keep all of that in mind and realize that the majority of Palestinians absolutely want peace, right? That you have radicals on both sides, in the Arab world and in Israel, in the Jewish world. The majority of people, all they want is peace. So you can have peace there, you have peace in the Holy Land, you have peace in the Middle East, and think what that will do in the world. That's why it's so critical to never leave. There's definitely a crisis. Any questions? Didn't do that good job, so
It's like, in recent years, there was like special persecution of Christians and seeds and
I checked, we're double checking to make sure it wasn't like,
I would say that especially outside of Israel. In Israel, I mean, think of it this way. Some Christians, especially in Israel proper, have rights.
It's my automatic.
If you live in Israel proper, okay, so let's say you live in Nazareth. There are many Christians doing very well in Nazareth, right? But the problems in northern Israel, right, if you're in Israel proper versus if you live in the West Bank, are completely different, right? The West Bank has all the unemployment. Israel proper doesn't have that same unemployment, right? You have Christians that the majority of what they're doing when you're in Palestine is you're just trying to look for food and water and education and all these things, right? Whereas in Nazareth, for example, when I go meet the pastor up there, our focus on using our money is completely different. What we're trying to do is build community and understanding your Catholic faith and things that we were talking about like in our church, right? Trying to be Catholic and then being light to the world. And it's very important for them to be light to the world. But in and amongst all that, we haven't seen this ISIS situation, right? I mean, think about that. How that just came out of nowhere, right? It was a total mess up in foreign policy as far as the U.S. policy is concerned, right? So when you think about that, when we were in Syria, what we let happen too, because we have some responsibility there, all of a sudden you think this is all gone. Oh, okay, this is, it's gone away. But when you take something away or out of another country, right, that vacuum effect is something else fills that spot. And ISIS came right in there and then boom. I mean, out of nowhere. Now, the problems that we have in Iraq. So Iraq, Syria are serious problems. No question. Has this always been the case? Absolutely, because Christians have been losing their lives forever, right? And not just the Middle East. I mean, right now, think of what has happened in Africa. I mean, we are very fortunate that we live in a country where we can say what we want for the most part, right? And somehow, for the most part, also be defended for that right. You speak up somewhere else, you're dead. So, I really value that. I mean, think of the young took these children, right? And they told the children, can you imagine this? That they would take your child, and then they would say, you need to convert and become Muslim. And then this little child says no. And then they kill the child. But they don't kill the parent. I mean, they make these parents witness this. I mean, as a parent myself, I can't imagine the depth of pain and suffering that would be. I can't even imagine it, right? It's just staying. I mean, do we really hold a Catholic faith? And when you think of what a treasure that is, and the value it is to us, to have, that fullness of truth. Yeah, no. Right? I mean, just to have that fullness of truth and to be able to trust in it. It's a real gift. These people are fighting for their life, giving up lives for that gift. We take it for granted. So, even as yourselves, I mean, you're here, you're involved in stuff in the church, trying to be involved in your adult ministry. I mean, good for you, right? But I can remember being, 25 years old and it not being important to me. And I'm kind of like one of those St. Paul people. I had to be kind of knocked off my horse and whatever. I mean, God did a real good job on me, by the way. But then what's your response, right? And I'm such an A-type personality, it's like all or nothing. I mean, do you want to just be a little Catholic, or do you want to be, is that impossible? So it's like in this, are you all in? You're either all in or you're nothing. You know what I mean? You can't be half Catholic. You can't be half part of the church. You can't be, I mean, that's the frustrating part, right? For all of us who love our faith so much. That, like for me, even watch my kids, if they were to walk away from the church or the faith, I don't care anything I've done for them financially, and I tell them, nothing that I have done is of any value to you, except one thing I want you to keep. You promise me you keep this, and that is, you keep the faith that I gave you, that I'm teaching you my whole life. Right? That's the one thing I can walk away with as a parent and say, my kids have that. Now it's up to them. They have to choose. That's my gift. That's the best I can do. But these people need you. No. A lot is happening. Any other questions? Well, one thing you can do, by the way, I did bring just something to help with. I got some brochures. And there's some, one of the things I got a few, just on the Franciscan boards